By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone against the most powerful military machine Europe had ever seen. Nazi Germany had swept across the continent with astonishing speed, crushing Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands in rapid succession. France, long considered one of Europe's strongest military powers, had collapsed in just 6 weeks. German armored divisions had reached the English Channel, forcing the British Expeditionary Force into a desperate evacuation from the beaches of Dunkirk. Although hundreds of thousands of British soldiers managed to escape across the water, they left behind most of their heavy equipment, vehicles, and artillery. The British Army returned home battered and dangerously underprepared for the possibility of a German invasion. Across the English Channel, Adolf Hitler now controlled almost the entire coastline of Western Europe. German aircraft and warships were preparing for Operation Sea Lion, the plan to invade Britain itself. In London, the new British Prime Minister Winston Churchill understood that the situation facing his country was extremely dangerous. Britain's army had been weakened, its allies in Western Europe had fallen, and German air power was preparing to strike across the Channel. The survival of Britain now depended on holding out long enough for the balance of the war to change. But Churchill knew that Britain alone could not defeat Nazi Germany in a long war. The German economy was enormous, its armies controlled most of Europe, and Hitler had access to the resources of conquered territory stretching from France to Poland. If Britain was to survive and eventually win the war, it would need help from a nation far more powerful than itself. That nation was the United States, led by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. At the start of the war in Europe, the United States had remained officially neutral. Many Americans believed that the conflicts raging across Europe should not involve the United States directly. Memories of the First World War were still strong, and there was widespread concern about becoming entangled in another costly overseas conflict. Roosevelt, however, understood the growing danger posed by Nazi Germany. Although American public opinion strongly favored neutrality, Roosevelt believed that a German victory in Europe would threaten global stability and eventually the security of the United States itself. Churchill recognized that Roosevelt might become Britain's most important ally, even if America was not yet ready to enter the war. From the earliest days of his leadership, Churchill began building a close relationship with the American president. The two men exchanged letters and messages discussing the rapidly changing situation in Europe. Churchill often described Britain's struggle as a fight, not only for its own survival, but for the defense of democracy itself. He hoped that by framing the war in these terms, he could convince Roosevelt that the United States had a stake in the outcome. Roosevelt listened carefully. Although he could not openly commit the United States to war, he began searching for ways to support Britain without directly violating American neutrality laws. In the months that followed, the communication between London and Washington grew increasingly important. Churchill knew that Britain's ability to continue fighting might depend on American supplies, weapons, and financial support. Roosevelt, meanwhile, understood that if Britain collapsed, Nazi Germany could dominate Europe entirely. As the war intensified during 1940, the relationship between these two leaders began to shape the future of the entire conflict. Britain might still be fighting alone on the battlefield, but Churchill was already working to ensure that the United States would eventually become part of the struggle against Hitler's expanding empire. During the dark months that followed the fall of France, Britain faced a crisis unlike any in its history. German bombers crossed the English Channel almost daily, launching massive air raids against British cities in what would become known as the Battle of Britain and later the Blitz. London, Liverpool, Coventry, and many other cities endured night after night of bombing as German aircraft attempted to break Britain's will to resist. Factories were destroyed, homes collapsed into rubble, and thousands of civilians were killed as the Luftwaffe tried to cripple Britain's war effort. Despite the devastation, Churchill remained determined that Britain would continue fighting. He delivered powerful speeches promising that the country would never surrender, insisting that even if Britain had to fight alone, it would resist German domination. But behind the confident public speeches, Churchill knew that Britain's military and economic resources were being stretched to the limit. The Royal Air Force had managed to repel the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain, preventing a German invasion, but the country's stockpiles of aircraft, ammunition, and supplies were shrinking rapidly. Britain was also facing a severe financial crisis. For years, the country had relied heavily on imports of food, fuel, and raw materials from overseas. Now, German submarines were attacking British shipping in the Atlantic, threatening the lifeline that connected Britain to the rest of the world. Churchill realized that if Britain ran out of money to purchase weapons and supplies, its ability to continue the war could collapse. This financial pressure made the relationship with the United States even more critical. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was watching the situation in Europe with growing concern. While American law still limited how much direct assistance could be given to countries at war, Roosevelt believed that Britain's survival was vital to preventing Nazi Germany from dominating the entire European continent. If Britain were defeated, Germany could potentially gain control of the powerful British Navy, overseas bases, and industrial resources. Such a scenario would dramatically shift the global balance of power and might eventually threaten the United States itself. Roosevelt, therefore, began looking for creative ways to help Britain continue the fight without formally entering the war. One of the most important steps came in 1941 with the introduction of the Lend-Lease program. This policy allowed the United States to supply weapons, vehicles, food, and other essential materials to countries whose defense was considered important to American security. For Britain, Lend-Lease became a lifeline. American factories began producing massive quantities of equipment that were shipped across the Atlantic to support the British war effort. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, and millions of tons of supplies flowed from American ports to Britain. These shipments allowed the British military to rebuild its strength after the losses suffered during the early stages of the war. Churchill understood immediately how crucial this support would be. He famously described Lend-Lease as the most unsordid act in history, recognizing that it gave Britain the resources needed to continue fighting when its own finances were nearly exhausted. The growing cooperation between Britain and the United States also strengthened the personal bond between Churchill and Roosevelt. Although the United States was still officially neutral, the two leaders were now working closely together to coordinate strategy and plan for a future in which America might play a much larger role in the war against Nazi Germany. By 1941, the partnership between Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt had begun to reshape the direction of the war. Although the United States was still officially neutral, cooperation between the two nations was growing rapidly. Britain depended heavily on American industrial power to continue its fight against Nazi Germany. Shipyards in the United States were producing merchant vessels to replace the ships sunk by German submarines in the Atlantic, while factories were manufacturing aircraft, tanks, and other equipment that Britain desperately needed. For Churchill, the importance of American support went far beyond supplies. He understood that the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany would likely require the full military strength of the United States. Britain could survive the war if it received American assistance, but defeating Germany's massive armies across Europe would require a far larger coalition. Churchill therefore worked constantly to strengthen the political and strategic relationship between the two countries. In August 1941, this effort led to a historic meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt aboard warships off the coast of Newfoundland. Although the United States had not yet entered the war, the two leaders agreed to meet in secret to discuss the future of the conflict and the principles that might guide the world after the war ended. During several days of discussions, Churchill and Roosevelt developed a joint statement that would become known as the Atlantic Charter. The document outlined shared goals such as national self-determination, freedom of trade, and the rejection of territorial expansion through aggression. While the Charter did not formally commit the United States to war, it signaled to the world that the two nations were increasingly united in their opposition to Nazi Germany. The Atlantic Charter represented more than a political declaration. It symbolized the growing alignment of British and American strategy during the war. Roosevelt still faced strong opposition at home from those who wanted the United States to remain out of the conflict. Many Americans feared that direct involvement in the war would lead to enormous casualties and economic disruption. Yet Roosevelt believed that supporting Britain was essential to preventing Germany from dominating Europe. Churchill understood the delicate balance Roosevelt had to maintain within American politics. He knew that the American president could not move too quickly toward war without risking a backlash from isolationist voices in Congress and among the public. Nevertheless, Churchill continued encouraging closer cooperation between the two countries. British and American military planners began quietly sharing intelligence and discussing long-term strategies for defeating Germany. Convoys protected by the British Navy carried American supplies across the Atlantic, while American warships began escorting some shipments through increasingly dangerous waters. The Atlantic Ocean itself had become a major battleground, as German U-boats attempted to cut the supply lines connecting Britain and the United States. Each successful convoy that reached British ports strengthened Churchill's belief that American involvement would eventually tip the balance of the war. The relationship between the two leaders was also strengthened by personal respect and communication. Churchill frequently wrote long messages to Roosevelt describing the situation in Britain and the wider war. Roosevelt, in turn, responded with encouragement and practical assistance. Together, they were slowly building a partnership that would soon become the foundation of the Allied war effort. Neither man could yet predict exactly when the United States would enter the war, but both understood that the future of the conflict might depend on the growing cooperation between their two nations. By late 1941, the growing partnership between Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt was about to enter a new and decisive phase. For more than a year, Roosevelt had supported Britain through programs like Lend-Lease and increased cooperation between the two countries' militaries. Yet, the United States was still officially neutral, and American forces had not yet joined the war against Nazi Germany. That situation changed dramatically on December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack shocked the American public and instantly transformed the political landscape in Washington. Within days, the United States declared war on Japan. Shortly afterward, Germany declared war on the United States, bringing America fully into the global conflict. For Churchill, this moment was one he had hoped for since the beginning of the war. Britain was no longer fighting alone. The entry of the United States into the conflict meant that the enormous industrial and military resources of the American nation would now be directed against the Axis powers. Churchill later recalled that when he received the news of Pearl Harbor, he immediately understood that Britain's survival was now far more secure. With the United States committed to the war, the balance of power was beginning to shift against Nazi Germany. Within weeks of the attack, Churchill traveled to Washington to meet Roosevelt in person. The meeting marked the beginning of a new phase in Allied cooperation as the two leaders began planning the strategy that would guide the war effort in the years ahead. During their meetings in Washington, Churchill and Roosevelt worked closely with military planners to determine how the Allied powers should coordinate their resources. One of the most important decisions made during these discussions was the adoption of the Germany First strategy. Although the United States had entered the war because of the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt agreed with Churchill that Nazi Germany represented the greatest long-term threat to global stability. As a result, the Allies decided that defeating Germany would take priority over operations in the Pacific. This decision shaped the entire course of the war. American industry began producing massive quantities of equipment, not only for its own military, but also for Britain and other Allied forces. Factories across the United States worked around the clock building ships, aircraft, tanks, and vehicles that would eventually be used in battles across Europe and North Africa. At the same time, American troops began deploying overseas to join British forces in combat. The cooperation between Churchill and Roosevelt now extended far beyond diplomatic messages and supply shipments. Their countries were fully committed partners in a global war against the Axis powers. Together, they oversaw the development of major Allied operations that would gradually push German forces back across Europe. Planning began for campaigns in North Africa, followed by invasions of Italy, and eventually the long-awaited assault on Nazi-occupied Western Europe. For Churchill, Roosevelt's leadership and the entry of the United States into the war represented the turning point he had hoped for during the darkest days of 1940. Britain had survived long enough for a powerful ally to join the struggle. With American industry and military power now fully engaged, the Allies were beginning to assemble the strength needed to defeat Hitler's empire and bring the war in Europe to an end. As the war progressed into 1943 and 1944, the partnership between Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt became one of the most important alliances of the entire conflict. With the United States now fully involved in the war, the Allied powers began coordinating large-scale military operations that would gradually push Nazi Germany back across Europe. American industry was producing weapons and supplies on a scale never seen before in modern history. Thousands of aircraft, tanks, trucks, and ships rolled out of factories across the United States, many of them destined for British and Allied forces fighting against Germany. The combined strength of British experience and American industrial power created a military force capable of challenging the German war machine across multiple fronts. Churchill and Roosevelt met several times during the war to discuss strategy and coordinate the growing Allied effort. Conferences in Casablanca, Tehran, and later Yalta brought together the leaders of the major Allied nations to determine how the war would be fought and how the post-war world might be organized. These meetings were not always easy. Churchill often preferred strategies that protected British interests and emphasized operations around the Mediterranean, while American planners sometimes pushed for more direct attacks against German forces in Western Europe. Roosevelt frequently acted as a mediator between competing views within the Allied command. Despite these disagreements, the partnership between Churchill and Roosevelt remained remarkably strong. Both leaders understood that cooperation between Britain and the United States was essential if the Allies were to defeat Nazi Germany. The most dramatic result of this cooperation came on June 6, 1944, when Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history along the coast of Normandy in German-occupied France. The operation, known as D-Day, involved thousands of ships, aircraft, and landing craft carrying Allied soldiers across the English Channel. British and American troops fought side by side on the beaches as they attempted to establish a foothold in Western Europe. The invasion had been planned for months by Allied commanders working under the strategic framework agreed upon by Churchill and Roosevelt. Success in Normandy opened the long-awaited Second Front against Germany in Western Europe, forcing Hitler's armies to fight major battles against both the Western Allies and the advancing Soviet forces in the East. From that moment onward, the collapse of Nazi Germany became increasingly inevitable. Allied armies pushed across France and into Germany itself, while Soviet troops advanced toward Berlin from the opposite direction. By May 1945, the Third Reich had been defeated, and the war in Europe came to an end. For Churchill, the victory was the result of years of determination and international cooperation. Britain had endured the darkest days of the war in 1940, standing alone against Nazi Germany when defeat seemed possible. But Churchill had always believed that with American support, the balance of power could eventually be reversed. Roosevelt's leadership and the entry of the United States into the war provided the resources and strength needed to defeat Hitler's regime. The partnership between these two leaders helped shape the strategy that ultimately brought victory to the Allied powers and ended one of the most destructive wars in human history